At my cousin's engagement party, my aunt joked, maybe one day you'll be lucky enough to find someone too. Everyone laughed while I sat there smiling through the shame. That night, I promised myself they'd all eat their words when I finally became the one they couldn't stop talking about. Quick, hit like, share with your friends, and subscribe. This story is about to get intense. I remember that night in vivid, painful detail. The house was warm, buzzing with laughter and the clinking of glasses, the scent of roast chicken and freshly baked bread lingering in the air. My cousin's engagement party was in full swing, and everyone seemed to radiate joy, so much so that it was almost unbearable to watch from the sidelines. I had arrived hopeful, dressed in my best clothes, hair neatly styled, trying to feel a little lighter, a little less like the awkward shadow in the corner of family gatherings. But as soon as I stepped inside, that illusion shattered. The living room was crowded, a tapestry of familiar faces, each one beaming as if their happiness could be inhaled like perfume. My aunt, the one with a laugh that always seemed sharper than it had any right to be, had her arm draped across my cousin's fiance's shoulder. She leaned in, voice carrying just enough to reach the edges of the room. Maybe one day you'll be lucky enough to find someone too, she said, and the air shifted. The laughter that followed felt like it splintered through my chest. Everyone else chuckled, some awkwardly, others with that cruel glee only relatives seemed to master. I smiled, a tight, brittle thing, forcing my lips to curve as if I were in on the joke, even though every fiber of me wanted to disappear into the floorboards. My fingers clutched my glass of sparkling water a little too hard. The bubbles tickled my throat, but I couldn't taste them. I slipped toward the edge of the room, the laughter echoing behind me like a distant storm, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes. Or maybe it was only my imagination. I hated this part. The subtle, invisible scoreboard where family members measured your success against someone else's. And in that moment, I felt the sharp sting of failure, the relentless sense of being perpetually not enough. The night went on. Conversations flowed around me like rivers I couldn't navigate. I watched my cousin and her fiance, their hands intertwined, eyes shining with the kind of love that seemed effortless, untouchable. I tried to anchor myself in other things, the food, the music, but every laugh, every congratulatory hug reminded me of the gap between them and me. When I finally stepped outside into the cool night air, the garden felt like an entirely different world. The string lights hanging from the trees swayed gently in the breeze, casting a golden glow on the dew-soaked grass. I inhaled sharply, the smell of wet earth grounding me. I didn't notice at first that someone was already sitting there on the bench, hood pulled low, shadows obscuring their face. Beautiful night, they said, voice low, almost hesitant. I blinked. I I didn't hear you come out. They shrugged. I like the quiet, a break from all that celebration noise. There was a pause. I could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. For reasons I couldn't explain, I found myself sharing everything I hadn't said in the living room. The shame, the sting, the humiliation. And they listened, really listened, as if my words were treasures and not complaints. I don't remember how long we sat there, the night stretching, folding in on itself. When I finally returned inside, the laughter had softened, the room a little warmer, the sting less sharp. And yet, when I lay awake later, the image of my aunt's smug smile haunted me. I could still hear her words echoing in my head. That night, I made a promise. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet, unyielding vow. One day, I would become someone who couldn't be ignored, someone they would talk about, someone who would command attention without having to ask for it. It started small, almost imperceptibly. I joined a local writing group, something I'd been putting off for years. The first few meetings were awkward. I stumbled over my words, felt eyes linger on my trembling hands, but slowly, I began to notice the difference between fear and anticipation. One story at a time, I built a new version of myself, a version that wasn't easily dismissed, that could stand under scrutiny and still shine. Work became a battlefield I quietly conquered. Every late night, every small victory stacked like bricks, building a foundation I didn't yet see but felt growing under my feet. I changed my habits, my routines, my way of thinking. I stopped waiting for life to hand me recognition and started carving it out myself. And through it all, that night's memory burned like a lighthouse in the distance, a reminder that I would not be invisible forever. Months turned into years. Invitations to family events continued, and with each one, the shadow of that initial humiliation loomed. But something inside me shifted. I no longer felt the need to hide in the corners. I didn't smile through the shame. I observed. I learned. I planned. There was a thrill in imagining the future in which my aunt's words would come back to her, not as vengeance, but as revelation. It was at another cousin's wedding 2 years later that the first tangible sign of that shift became clear. I walked into the reception hall and the room seemed to notice me differently. Heads turned, not in ridicule, but curiosity. Conversations paused just a fraction too long, eyes following me as I moved with a confidence I hadn't possessed before. My aunt caught my gaze, a flicker of recognition, or maybe unease, passing across her features. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. That unsettled me more than anything. I found myself observing the interactions, reading the room like it was a story in progress. I noticed subtle glances, the way certain words hung longer in the air when I spoke. It was intoxicating, but also terrifying. For the first time, I understood the power of presence, the silent influence that doesn't demand attention but inevitably commands it. Then came the encounter that changed everything. I was in the garden, once again alone, when someone approached. This time, it wasn't random. Their eyes held recognition, and there was something almost magnetic in the way they studied me. "You've changed," they said, and the weight of those words sank deep. Not just in the physical sense, but in the way they pressed against the self I had always believed I was. "I've been working on it," I admitted, voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. They smiled, enigmatic, almost knowing. "You've done more than that." And in that moment, I realized that my promise, the one made quietly in humiliation, was no longer a fantasy. It was unfolding. Piece by piece, I was becoming the person I had imagined in the shadows of my own doubt. But as satisfying as it was, there was a new, unfamiliar fear creeping in. What if becoming the one everyone notices came with consequences I hadn't anticipated? What if the attention I craved carried a cost I couldn't foresee? That night, as I returned home, the house silent and the city's hum muted by distance, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. The person staring back at me was not the same one who had smiled through shame at my cousin's engagement. They had teeth and claws now, in a metaphorical sense, and a presence that could not be ignored. But I could see the shadows still lingering behind my eyes, shadows that whispered of the cost of ambition, of the perilous edge between triumph and obsession. I didn't sleep that night, not because of excitement, but because I realized that transformation is never straightforward. It's messy, unpredictable, and often terrifying. And yet, the thrill of it, the intoxicating awareness that one day everyone would have to see me as I truly was, kept me awake, pacing, planning, dreaming. That's where my story truly begins. Not at the engagement party, but in the hours afterward, in the silent promises made to myself, in the quiet obsession of becoming someone unforgettable. And what I didn't know then was that the journey ahead would be filled with more twists, more betrayals, and more moments of sheer disbelief than I could have imagined. Because power, true magnetic power, has a way of attracting both allies and enemies. And sometimes, the ones you least expect can become the greatest obstacles to your destiny. The following months felt like living in a different dimension. Every day I became more aware of the way people moved around me, of the subtle gravitational pull I was starting to generate without even trying. It was intoxicating, yet disorienting. I'd grown used to being invisible, so this sudden awareness of presence felt almost dangerous. My reflection in the mirror no longer showed just my face. It showed intention, ambition, a kind of quiet recklessness I didn't entirely recognize in myself. It started with small victories. At work, my ideas, once brushed aside as naive or half-formed, began to attract attention. Colleagues sought my input, not because it was convenient, but because they sensed I had something unique to offer. I learned to walk into meetings with a deliberate confidence, my posture straight, my gaze steady, my voice calm but firm. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who didn't know me, but I could feel it in the way the air around me shifted. Conversations slowed when I spoke. People listened, and secretly I relished it. It was during one of those days, seated at a quiet corner table in a small cafe, that I noticed her. She wasn't part of my world, at least not yet. But the way she moved across the room made it impossible to ignore her. She was alone, sipping a dark coffee, staring at a notebook with a furrowed brow. Her hair was pulled into a loose knot, strands falling around her face in deliberate chaos. Something about her radiated focus, determination, and maybe a hint of mystery. I wanted to approach her, not just because of attraction, but because there was something in the way she existed that challenged me, that made me want to engage, to understand. But I hesitated. It had been drilled into me over the years: never rush, always observe. Patience is a weapon. So I watched, pretending to read, noticing how she tapped her pen against the page when frustrated, how her eyes darted around the room as if searching for inspiration in the ordinary. Days turned into weeks. The cafe became a ritual. Every morning I arrived early, sitting at the same table, watching her from a distance, learning her rhythms. And inevitably, our paths crossed. She looked up one day and caught my gaze. There was no shyness in her, only curiosity, sharp and analytical. "Do I know you?" she asked, not accusatory but precise, as though she were taking mental notes. "No," I said, voice calm, measured. "Not yet." Her lips curved into a half smile. "Good answer." It was the beginning of something unpredictable. She didn't fall into the usual traps of charm or flattery. She challenged me. She dissected my words, questioned my assumptions, and sometimes, almost cruelly, pointed out inconsistencies in my stories. And yet, with each exchange, I felt myself drawn deeper into her orbit. Not love, not yet, but something more dangerous: fascination. At the same time, my family life was a minefield. Invitations kept coming: birthdays, dinners, weddings. And with each one, the old tension returned, sharp and familiar. My aunt's smirk never faded completely. Even as I walked into rooms with a presence she could no longer ignore, she made small jabs, veiled compliments that carried the sting of her old jokes. "You've done well for yourself," she'd say, voice sugary but eyes suspicious. I'm almost surprised. Almost. Those words meant to undermine fueled me. I'd begun to understand something essential. Humiliation has a power only if you allow it. And I no longer did. The tight smile, the polite nod, the careful words, these were armor now, not a mask. I moved through rooms like a shadow that could not be dismissed, leaving whispers in my wake, though I didn't seek them. And yet, as I grew stronger, as I built my presence, I realized power attracts attention in ways that aren't always pleasant. One evening, at a networking event that was part business, part social theater, I felt it for the first time. The undercurrent of envy, the quiet plotting that happens when someone rises too fast, too confidently. He approached me first, a man with a smooth voice, a perfectly tailored suit, but eyes that held calculation rather than warmth. "I hear you've been making waves," he said, sliding into the space beside me, one hand resting casually on the bar. "Quite impressive for someone who used to be invisible." I smiled, neutral, measured. "People change." He leaned closer, voice dropping. "Yes, but some change too fast. It can be dangerous, especially when others have stakes in your downfall." I met his gaze evenly, noting the sharpness beneath the charm. I realized that my rise had painted a target on my back, though I had been too consumed with self-transformation to notice. The thrill I had felt in gaining attention was now tinged with fear, a reminder that being seen carries a price. That night, as I walked home, the city felt different. The streetlights seemed harsher, the shadows longer. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes following me, though I turned corners, crossed streets, and no one was there. It was paranoia, I told myself, Or maybe instinct. Either way, I couldn't ignore it. Then the twist came, the first real test of my resolve. A package arrived at my door the next morning. No sender, no note. Just a black box, matte finish, heavy in my hands. Inside, a single photo of my aunt at my cousin's engagement party, laughing, pointing, that same old smirk plastered across her face. But it wasn't just a photograph. Scribbled along the edges, in sharp, almost jagged handwriting, were the words, "Not everyone gets the happy ending they deserve." The message was clear. Someone was watching, calculating, waiting, and not just anyone. Someone who knew me, knew my history, knew the humiliation that had fueled my every move since that night. I didn't sleep that night either. My mind raced with possibilities. Who had sent it? Why now? And most importantly, what did they expect me to do? Retreat, react, or rise higher? The temptation to confront my family, to lay everything bare, was strong, but something told me this was a test, a puzzle I had to solve carefully. In the following weeks, the tension escalated. Subtle incidents began to accumulate. A misplaced document at work that could have caused embarrassment, whispered rumors that seemed carefully timed, strangers appearing at the cafe when I knew I had been alone. Each event was minor in isolation, but together they formed a pattern, a network of manipulation designed to unsettle me. And yet I refused to crumble. Each obstacle became a game, each threat a challenge. I learned to move with a precision I hadn't before, anticipating, strategizing, observing. I wasn't just surviving, I was learning to play a game I hadn't even known existed. The cafe, once a sanctuary, became another stage. She noticed too. One afternoon, as I sat across from her, she leaned in, lowering her voice. "Something's happening," she said, eyes sharp, scanning the room. "You feel it, don't you?" I nodded. "I do, but I don't know who or why." She studied me for a long moment. "Be careful. Not everyone who smiles at you means well, and not every hand extended is offering help." Her words hit harder than any threat. There was an intimacy in the warning, an unspoken understanding that danger wasn't always obvious, that the people who appear closest to you sometimes harbor the sharpest knives. And then came the revelation I hadn't anticipated. One evening, after weeks of following leads and observing patterns, I discovered the truth. The architect of my recent discomfort wasn't a stranger at all. It was someone within my family, someone I'd trusted, someone who had never forgiven me for the silent vow I made that night at my cousin's engagement. I confronted them privately, in a room that smelled faintly of old wood and polished leather. The tension was unbearable, electric. Their eyes were calm, almost too calm, but the slightest twitch of a smile betrayed satisfaction. "You've changed that," they said. "I'll give you that. But remember, power isn't everything. You think you've outgrown me, but some scars run too deep." I looked at them, seeing not just the person, but the years of rivalry, resentment, and obsession that had culminated here. I realized with a shiver that the battle I thought was external, the anonymous threats, the whispers, the calculated disturbances, had always been internal, a reflection of the family dynamics I had inherited and now had to navigate. That night, I didn't just sleep. I planned. The journey wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about understanding the rules of this new world I'd entered, one where attention, ambition, and secrecy intertwined. I knew that if I faltered, even for a moment, the delicate balance I had built over years could collapse. But if I succeeded, the payoff would be unimaginable. I understood something crucial then. Becoming the one people couldn't stop talking about was not about the applause, the recognition, or the fleeting satisfaction of outshining them. It was about mastering the narrative, controlling the story of who I was and who I would become. And for the first time, I realized that my journey was no longer just personal. It was chess, a game with rules I was only beginning to understand, where every move carried weight, every ally could be a threat, and every revelation was a piece of a puzzle with consequences far beyond my imagination. The revelation hit me like ice water. Someone I had trusted, someone who had once been a constant in my life, was the source of every shadow, every subtle sabotage, every whispered rumor that had haunted me over the past months. The realization wasn't just shocking, it was exhilarating in a strange, dark way. I wasn't powerless anymore. I'd grown strong enough to see the patterns, to anticipate moves before they happened. And now, for the first time, I understood the rules of the game I had been thrust into. I spent that night pacing the apartment, the city lights casting fractured shadows across the walls. The quiet hum of traffic outside felt distant, almost irrelevant, drowned out by the rush of thoughts and strategies swirling in my mind. I had to be careful. Reckless confrontation could backfire, but ignoring the truth would be a mistake I could never forgive myself for. My aunt's smirk at that engagement party flashed in my mind again, sharper now, more taunting. I had once promised myself that they would eat their words, but the timing had to be perfect. Every move calculated, every reveal precise. Days passed as I observed, planned, and tested the waters. I became adept at reading micro expressions, the subtle tells that betrayed more than words ever could. My interactions with family became a delicate dance, nodding politely, responding with warmth while simultaneously gathering intelligence. I discovered that my aunt had allies, distant relatives, friends, even colleagues at work who had an interest in seeing me stumble. But I also realized that she underestimated me. She always had. And that underestimation became my weapon. It began subtly. I started planting ideas, hints, and suggestions in casual conversation that were designed to provoke reactions, to flush out hidden motives. The thrill of seeing my plan unfold was almost intoxicating. I watched as carefully laid traps began to reveal the truth, one piece at a time. Allies turned into liabilities. Secrets were exposed not through confrontation, but through the quiet, deliberate manipulation of circumstance. The cafe became my strategy room. The woman I had noticed months ago, the one whose focus and precision mirrored my own, became my unintentional accomplice. She never asked for details, never pried too deeply, but her presence was a grounding force. One evening, she spoke for the first time about her own understanding of power and influence in the most unassuming way. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who let others underestimate them, she said, eyes fixed on her notebook. The ones who wait, observe, and then strike at the perfect moment. I almost laughed. Perfect description. Almost. I didn't say anything. I simply watched her, noting the precision in her movements, the way her words seemed carefully chosen yet completely natural. There was something about her, not just her intellect, but her quiet confidence that made her magnetic. And I realized almost reluctantly that I was drawn to more than just her mind. The first major confrontation came unexpectedly. It was a family dinner meant to celebrate my cousin's promotion, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. My aunt, sensing that I had changed, decided to test the waters. Her smirk was back, sharper, colder, a weapon disguised as humor. "You've done well for yourself," she said, voice sugary but with a pointed edge. "I almost don't recognize you anymore." I smiled, but it wasn't brittle or forced this time. "People grow," I said simply, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. The subtle silence that followed was delicious. My aunt blinked, a flicker of unease crossing her features, but she quickly masked it. She didn't understand that I was no longer reacting. I was controlling the room, the moment, the narrative. And then the twist came, one I had not fully anticipated. A cousin, previously distant and neutral, pulled me aside after dinner. "You need to know," they whispered, eyes darting around. "There's more at play than you realize. Aunt isn't just competitive, she's orchestrating something much bigger." I froze. "Bigger?" "Yes," they said. "There's a network, subtle but powerful. People she's influenced in ways you don't see. She's testing you, pushing boundaries. If you misstep, it won't just be humiliation. There could be consequences, legal, financial, social. She's methodical. You have to be careful." The revelation changed everything. My aunt's attacks weren't just petty or familial. They were strategic, calculated, designed to test my limits, my patience, my intelligence. And yet, instead of fear, I felt a surge of excitement. The stakes were higher than I had imagined. This was no longer a simple game of family dynamics. It was a full-scale challenge, one that would test Every skill I had honed, every lesson I had learned, every ounce of cunning I possessed. The days that followed were a whirlwind of observation and preparation. I became hyper aware of conversations, subtly shifting the flow of discussions to test reactions. I noticed patterns: who aligned with my aunt, who could be swayed, who was neutral, who could be an asset if approached correctly. I started keeping meticulous notes, almost obsessively, mapping out relationships, influence, and potential vulnerabilities. Every meal, every gathering, every casual conversation became a data point in a larger strategy. And then, unexpectedly, a shift occurred. My aunt herself began to change tactics, perhaps realizing that her usual methods were no longer sufficient. The jabs became subtler, the smirks replaced with polite nods, the barbs hidden behind compliments. But the underlying tension remained, an invisible wire stretching taut between us. I realized that she was aware I was growing stronger, that she could sense the shift in power. One evening, at a charity gala, the culmination of months of subtle maneuvering came to a head. The room was opulent, chandeliers casting fractured light across polished marble floors. I moved through the crowd with purpose, scanning, observing, noting reactions. My aunt was present, of course, her presence commanding attention as always. But this time, I noticed the subtle cracks, the slight hesitation in her smile, the way she observed me with more caution than usual. And then it happened. A conversation, seemingly casual between my aunt and a prominent family acquaintance, was subtly manipulated by me. I planted a question earlier in the evening, seemingly innocuous, and now it bore fruit. Their dialogue, overheard by several influential attendees, revealed more than my aunt intended: her ambitions, her frustrations, her subtle machinations over the years. It was a revelation wrapped in polite conversation, a public exposure crafted with precision. The room shifted. People who had once smiled politely at her began to glance at me differently. Whispers followed me as I moved, curiosity and admiration mingling with speculation. My aunt's smirk returned, but it was now tinged with recognition that the game had changed, that I had grown into a force she could no longer ignore. And yet, even as I savored this victory, a deeper, more unsettling realization took hold. The woman from the cafe, the one I had observed, the one who had challenged me in subtle ways, was now speaking directly to me in a quiet corner. "You're good," she said, voice low, eyes sharp. "Better than I expected. But remember, someone else is always watching. Someone who doesn't want you to win, and someone who knows you better than you think." Her words, meant as caution, struck deeper than any threat from my aunt. I realized that the game was far from over. There were players I hadn't accounted for, forces operating in the shadows, observing, influencing, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And I understood with sudden clarity that the journey I had embarked upon, the transformation, the rise, the strategic mastery, was only the beginning. That night, as I returned home, I felt the weight of anticipation heavier than ever. The victory at the gala was exhilarating, but it also exposed me, laid bare the fact that power is never absolute, that attention and influence come with consequences that are unpredictable and often dangerous. I stared at my reflection, and for the first time, I saw not just myself, but the network of relationships, ambitions, and rivalries that now defined my world. I realized that my promise, the one made in humiliation at my cousin's engagement, was evolving. It was no longer about proving others wrong or even about becoming the one people couldn't stop talking about. It was about survival, mastery, and understanding the rules of a game far more complex than I had ever imagined. And I knew, deep down, that the most shocking twists, the betrayals, the revelations, the moments that would redefine everything were still ahead. Because in a world where influence and attention are power, nothing is ever what it seems. Allies can be enemies, enemies can become allies, and the narrative you control today can be rewritten by forces you cannot yet see. And I had only just begun to scratch the surface. The weeks after the gala were a blur of calculated moves, quiet observations, and whispered confrontations. I had tasted victory, and it was addictive, But I also knew that success often carries the heaviest burden. Power reveals cracks, and cracks reveal vulnerabilities. My aunt, for all her cunning, had underestimated me, but the woman from the cafe had reminded me that someone else was always watching, someone with far more knowledge of me than I had anticipated. I had become hyper vigilant, noting patterns, predicting reactions, and testing the waters with subtle provocations. Every conversation, every meeting, every passing glance became a puzzle piece. And yet, beneath the strategy, a strange unease settled in, a feeling that the stakes were about to rise beyond anything I had encountered. It began with a letter slipped under my door late one night. The envelope was thick, cream colored, and completely unmarked. Inside, there was only a single sentence, written in elegant, precise handwriting. You are not the only one shaping this story. No signature, no clue, nothing else. But the words were enough to send a chill down my spine. Someone else was moving, manipulating, perhaps orchestrating events that I could not yet perceive. I spent the next day retracing every interaction I had had, every casual comment I had made, and every subtle maneuver I had executed. There was nothing overt, nothing tangible, but the sense of being observed, of being countered, was undeniable. It was as though a shadow had emerged to mirror my every move, anticipating, countering, and waiting. And then it happened. I was at a high profile art exhibit, one of those events where social currency is as valuable as the art itself. The room was filled with murmurs of admiration, the smell of paint and polished wood mixing with expensive perfume and cologne. I moved confidently through the crowd, aware of the glances that followed me, the subtle nods of acknowledgement. My aunt was there naturally, her presence commanding attention as usual. She caught my eye, smiled, and for a moment I saw the old smugness, the one that had haunted me years ago, but it quickly dissolved into something more complex: wariness. I hadn't expected confrontation here, not directly, but she had always understood the subtle art of control. And as I approached a particular sculpture, I noticed something odd: a figure watching me from the shadows, partially obscured by a column. I didn't recognize them immediately, but there was an air of familiarity, a precision in the way they observed me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The woman from the cafe appeared beside me almost silently. He's back, she murmured, her eyes narrowing. The one orchestrating everything behind the scenes. I felt a tightening in my chest. I thought it was just my aunt. She shook her head. She's part of it, yes, but she isn't the whole story. Someone else is guiding her, pushing events, testing you, and you've caught their attention. Her words sent a ripple of fear and adrenaline through me. I had anticipated challenges, manipulations, and rivalries, but I had never considered a hidden hand controlling my every move. And the realization that I was now a piece on a far larger chessboard made my pulse race. Over the next few days, I became a ghost, moving carefully, analyzing every interaction, searching for clues. Every phone call, every email, every casual conversation became a potential hint, a puzzle to decode. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. Certain incidents that I had previously dismissed as coincidences, misplaced documents, subtle rumors, unexplained encounters, now appeared connected, strands woven into a deliberate design. It was then that I realized something terrifying. I had underestimated my adversary. The level of precision, patience, and knowledge required to manipulate events on this scale was staggering. This wasn't just a family rivalry or petty jealousy. This was strategy, foresight, and calculation at a level I hadn't encountered. And yet, the thrill of the challenge awakened a side of me I hadn't fully embraced. The part of me that thrived under pressure, that relished the complexity of power and influence. One evening, I arranged a meeting with my aunt under the guise of reconciliation. The setting was neutral: a quiet restaurant, low lighting, soft jazz playing in the background. She arrived promptly, her posture impeccable, smile practiced. We exchanged polite greetings, and for a moment it seemed as though the years of tension could dissolve into civility. But beneath the surface, the game was still on. I spoke deliberately, planting subtle suggestions, gauging reactions, testing boundaries. And she, in turn, responded with caution, measured words, and careful gestures. It was a dance, a duel disguised as conversation, and I felt the familiar thrill of power balanced against the potential for disaster. Then came the twist I hadn't anticipated. Midway through our conversation, she leaned in slightly, voice lowered. "You've done well," she said. "Better than I expected. But you should know, the game is bigger than either of us. There's someone pulling the strings, and their reach is far beyond what you imagine. One wrong step, and it won't just be embarrassment. It could destroy everything you've built." Her words hit harder than any threat I had faced. The hidden player, the orchestrator, was not just powerful, but ruthless, patient, and deeply knowledgeable about me. And the realization that my every move had been observed, anticipated, and countered sent a shiver down my spine. That night, I lay awake, mind racing with possibilities. Who could possess such insight, such patience, such a willingness to manipulate and control from the shadows? And why target me? The stakes were no longer personal humiliation. They were survival, strategy, and dominance in a game I hadn't fully understood. In the following weeks, the tension escalated. Small incidents, misplaced items, altered schedules, casual remarks designed to unsettle me became more frequent. I realized that every ally I had, every friend I had trusted, could be a pawn in this larger game. And yet, I refused to retreat. Instead, I embraced the challenge, becoming more precise, more deliberate, more cunning. Every move I made was calculated, every interaction observed, every potential vulnerability analyzed. And then the final revelation occurred in the most unexpected way. It was a casual dinner, a seemingly ordinary evening, when the woman from the cafe, my confidant, my observer, my mirror, revealed the truth. We were seated quietly, away from the crowd, the low hum of conversation surrounding us. She looked at me, her eyes sharp, almost piercing. "You want to know who's behind everything, don't you?" she asked. I nodded, heart pounding. She smiled faintly, a mixture of admiration and warning. "It's someone you trust more than anyone. Someone who has been shaping your path, testing your limits, manipulating events to see if you could rise. And you've done more than they expected. But here's the twist. They're closer than you think. Much closer." Her words hung in the air like a shadow, heavy and ominous. I felt a mix of fear, anticipation, and exhilaration. The journey I had embarked upon, the transformation, the rise, the strategy, the calculated risks, was approaching its climax. And I realized with sudden clarity that the ultimate revelation would not only redefine my understanding of power, influence, and family, but also challenge the very core of who I thought I was. That night, as I returned home, the city lights casting fractured patterns across my walls, I felt the weight of anticipation like a physical presence. The promise I had made years ago and the quiet humiliation of my cousin's engagement was about to come full circle. But the endgame was far more complex, more dangerous, and more shocking than I had ever imagined. Because in a world where influence, observation, and strategy dictate the outcome, the final move is never obvious. And the true power lies not in who strikes first, but in who understands the game completely. And I had only just begun to uncover the full rules. The tension had been building for months, like a storm slowly gathering on the horizon. And now it felt as though the first flash of lightning had finally appeared. Every step I took, every word I spoke, every glance I cast over my shoulder carried the weight of anticipation. The hidden orchestrator, the one who had manipulated my rise, tested my limits, and orchestrated the subtle sabotage that had haunted me, was closer than I had ever imagined. And tonight I would finally see the full scope of their plan. It began at my aunt's house, a place that had once been a theater of humiliation, now transformed into a battleground of power. I had agreed to dinner under the guise of reconciliation, though in truth, every fiber of me was prepared for confrontation. The dining room was immaculately set, chandeliers casting soft pools of light over the polished table, the air scented with roasted meats and spices. My aunt greeted me with the same practiced smile, but this time, I noticed the subtle tension in her posture, the quick glances that betrayed uncertainty. We exchanged pleasantries, small talk that masked the undercurrent of rivalry simmering beneath the surface. I observed her carefully, noting every flicker of emotion, every hesitation, every twitch of her hands. Across the table, my cousin chatted absent-mindedly, oblivious to the storm brewing in subtle glances and half smiles. But I didn't need their attention. I only needed my aunt's. She was the key. She had orchestrated, guided, tested, and now it was my turn to reveal the cards I had been holding close for years. And then she spoke, the words that changed everything. "You've done, well," she said, voice careful, measured. "Better than I expected. But don't think for a moment that you know the full picture. You're only seeing what I allow you to see." I leaned back, eyes steady. "And yet here I am, at your table, seeing more than you intended." Her smile faltered, just slightly. I could feel the subtle shift in power, the tension bending toward me, drawn by the precision of my calm. I realized in that moment that all the strategies, all the patience, all the meticulous observations had brought me to this instant, the confrontation where everything would be revealed. Then, the twist, the one I had not fully anticipated, occurred. From the shadows of the dining room, the woman from the cafe appeared, almost silently. She had been there all along, observing, guiding, ensuring that I was prepared for the culmination of events. But now she stepped forward, her gaze locking with mine. "It's time," she said softly. "You need to see the whole story, all of it." And suddenly the hidden orchestrator revealed themselves. Not my aunt, not any distant relative, but someone I had never suspected. Someone whose quiet presence had always been a constant undercurrent in my life. My breath caught as the pieces fell into place. The subtle manipulations, the whispered warnings, the calculated tests, all led back to them. The realization was shocking, almost surreal. "You've grown strong," they said, voice calm, precise. "Stronger than I expected, but strength without understanding can be dangerous. That's why I needed to test you to see if you could navigate the complexity, the subtle dynamics, the human chessboard I set before you." I felt a mixture of fear, awe, and exhilaration. The person I had underestimated, the silent force behind every challenge, had orchestrated not just my rise, but the very environment that shaped me. Every obstacle, every whisper, every misstep had been deliberate, a test of patience, intellect, and resilience. And now, I faced the final reckoning. The conversation unfolded like a duel, words sharp and precise, each phrase carefully chosen, each pause deliberate. My aunt's role became clear. She had been a player, yes, but not the mastermind. She had tested me in ways that were visible, but the true test, the one that mattered, had been orchestrated by the person I least expected. Every smile, every compliment, every subtle threat had been designed to observe my reactions, measure my resilience, and gauge my capacity for strategy. And yet, despite the shock, I realized something essential. I had been prepared. Every late night of reflection, every careful observation, every calculated move had built me into someone capable of facing this revelation without crumbling. The humiliation of years past, the whispered jokes, the subtle ridicule, they had all been catalysts, forging me into the person who could navigate this complex web of manipulation. We spoke for hours, the conversation flowing seamlessly between confrontation and revelation. The orchestrator explained their motives, not malice, not revenge, but a desire to see what I was capable of, to challenge me, to force me to rise above mediocrity, to confront the shadows within myself and in my environment. It was a revelation both unsettling and exhilarating, a reminder that the world is rarely straightforward, that influence and power are layered, complex, and often hidden in plain sight. By the end of the night, everything had changed. I no longer saw my aunt as the antagonist, my family as mere spectators, or myself as a passive participant. I understood the intricate dance of human behavior, the subtle manipulations that guide interactions, the hidden forces that shape outcomes. And I realized that the journey I had embarked upon, the rise from humiliation, the pursuit of presence, the careful orchestration of influence, was only the beginning. The final twist came quietly, almost imperceptibly. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I saw her, the woman from the cafe, waiting, calm and observant. "You've done more than survive," she said, her voice low, almost reverent. "You've mastered the game. But remember, mastery isn't a destination. It's a constant, evolving challenge. And the most dangerous moves are the ones you cannot anticipate." Her words resonated deeply. I realized that my promise, the one I had made silently in humiliation years ago, had transformed into something far greater. It was no longer about proving my worth to family or about being the one they couldn't stop talking about. It was about understanding the complexity of influence, mastering the subtle dynamics of human behavior, and navigating a world where perception, strategy, and presence dictate outcomes. As I walked home, the city lights reflecting in puddles from a recent rain, I felt a sense of clarity I'd never experienced before. The past, the humiliation, the whispered jokes, they had all been instruments shaping the person I had become. And now, with the full picture revealed, I understood that power, influence, and perception are intertwined, unpredictable, and infinitely complex. I paused for a moment, staring at my reflection in a shop window, the distorted image of light and shadow blending with my own. I saw strength, intelligence, resilience, and presence. I also saw the subtle shadows of doubt, the reminders that even mastery requires vigilance, observation, and adaptation. The journey was far from over. It was a living, evolving challenge, one that would continue to test, to shape, and to reveal new depths of character and strategy. And as I walked on, I realized the most profound truth of all. The people who shape us, who challenge us, who test us, sometimes in ways that feel cruel, subtle, or manipulative, are often preparing us for moments we cannot yet imagine. And the strength we build in response, the mastery we achieve through observation, strategy, and resilience, becomes a force that defines us, shapes our world, and leaves an indelible mark on those around us. Reflecting now, I wonder, how often are the challenges we face orchestrated, not by malice, but by design, to test our limits? How much of the world around us is shaped by forces we cannot see, and how much power lies in our ability to observe, adapt, and respond? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, when we finally rise above, when we master the game, what price do we pay for the clarity, the influence, and the understanding we gain?